Hello everybody. This video is going to go over some higher order array methods, including forEach, filter, map, and reduce. So let's get right into it here. forEach, think of forEach as a better alternative to your typical for loop. So before we go on, actually, I just want to point out that I have two arrays defined above, one being just a very one-dimensional years array, just different years in it, and another one with a bunch of different animals where each index is actually its own object. So at first, I'll do like some more simple examples with this years array, but we'll move on to more complicated examples with this object there. Or the array of objects, I should say. So for each, let's look at an old way of how we would count something. So let's look at this year's array, and let's say I want to count how many years in this array come before the year 2000, right? So the old way would be we call it a function, and also I do want to mention that I'm mainly going to be using arrow functions this video. I'll post a nice link below of some documentation on arrow functions if you're not familiar with it. And also I'll touch base a little bit on how they work. But for now, I'll do the old way of a for each using ES5 syntax. And we'll call this before year counter because we just want to count how many years come before our input year. So we'll say it has two parameters, one being an array of years and one being the chosen year that we want to test each year against, right? So first things first, we have to define something to track an incrementer. Let me call this an incrementer. And now we want to do our usual for loop that you guys are used to seeing, where I is less than year array dot length, and we increment I each time. Now we can put our if statement here, where if the ith index of the year array is less than our chosen year that will be passed as an argument, then we can increment our incrementer. Right, and now we can also put this if statement on one line since there's only one thing we need to happen here, right? We just need the incrementer incremented. If we had multiple lines of code to define what happens if this if statement returns true, then we would need to break it out into its usual brackets, but for now, we're good with the one-liner. And that's going to be a theme here. We're going to break as many things down into one line in this tutorial as much as possible. And it's going to look clean, and you're going to look great doing it. I promise. So once this incrementer is incremented in that for loop, we're good to return the incrementer. Right? So now we can console.log the before year counter. And let's pass it our years, which is the name of this const up there, and the chosen year, which is 2000. So great, there are 6 years apparently that come before 2000. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Great. So working as intended, but once again, that's the old way. That's not what we're interested in, right? So let's go ahead and get rid of it. Old news. So the new way, Mr. Fancy Pants. So now using ES6 syntax, we're going to be starting to use the arrow functions now. And now, once again, I'll briefly describe them. And if you're still not clear, there's a link right below that'll put you on your way. So const before year counter. Once again, it takes the same parameters, and now instead of having this old function before year counter and such, we have this little arrow that actually implies that these parameters belong to a function and that they're going to return this. So once these brackets are open here, you can carry on and do everything you normally do inside of a function's curly brackets there. And we'll get onto it. You'll see later that if you don't have these brackets, it'll implicitly just return whatever is there. So if I put 2 there, it's just going to return 2. See? But we don't want to return 2 here, right? We need an if statement. And we're not going to be able to just do this arrow with no brackets because we have the if statement, right? And we need to also increment a counter. And this is what the forEach is all about. Its main purpose is just helping us from, or preventing us from having to lay out this I and use this square bracket notation. It ends up being much more clean. So I guess I'll stop babbling about it and just go ahead and show you guys. So now, since it says it's an array method, so similar to once you've seen, you may have seen join, or you may have seen split or slice, or any of those. forEach is exactly like that. It's an array method, except now it takes a callback function. So we're going to define another function here, and it sounds way more intimidating than it is, but this callback function is going to expect a year. That's its argument, which is already being passed into it because of this forEach method. So let me keep going, and I'll break it down a little bit more. So for each year, we want, oh, I almost forgot, we need to define our incrementer up here as well. So we have the value stored, and we can keep incrementing. So what we're saying is, in the year array that we pass in as an argument, for each year, and this name isn't exactly important, we can name this X if we wanted to, we can name it whatever we wanted to. That's a variable that we're defining technically. So for each year, we now want to say if the year, which is this, pertaining to this right there, is less than the chosen year, which is pertaining to this up here, then we want to increment our incrementer. Otherwise, do nothing. We don't care if it is greater than or equal to. Nothing needs to happen. And then on the bottom, we just return the incrementer. And once again, look, we get 6. Great. It turned out perfectly fine. So let's take another look at this. So its main function here is, once again, it just looks much cleaner than having to do a typical for loop and go through that, because the forEach automatically hits each and every one of these, as if the name wasn't enough, the forEach name. And yeah, it takes each year, so each time it goes through here, we define each index as a year pretty much. So we have, for each year, we're testing that year to see if it's less than the chosen year. And if so, then we increment. So that's pretty much it for forEach for now. I'm sure a lot of you probably already know about forEach. So let's get moving on to filter. And, alright. So the filter method creates a new array based on it passing the test that you provide to it. And you'll see that in just a moment. Let me get this out of our way. Let me comment this out. Alright, so now let's do, instead of a forEach and incrementing, let's create a new array where we only want to return the years that are less than year 2000. Okay, so now I'm going to move straight into, or going to be using ES6 from this point forward. So we're going to be using the arrow function. We'll say we'll call this function earlier years, and its argument or parameters it's going to ask for is a year array again. And in this arrow syntax, we don't need to wrap these in parentheses if there's only one parameter. So yeah, we can just leave this as is, no parentheses. And what we want to return is this year array dot filter, and once again this is an array method. It's similar to the forEach, so we take the array that we want to filter, put a dot filter on it, and now for each year we want to say if year is less than 2000, then we return the year. It's good. It's welcome into our new array. If not, sorry, you didn't make the cut. So we're going to console.log now. I think that's good to go. Earlier years, and we'll pass it our years. Oh, what did I miss? Aha, because I'm not returning anything. Remember, once you open these brackets, it'll treat it like a regular function, and nothing is explicitly being returned. On this function, we are returning something for our array method filter, but not for the earlier years function itself. So if I put a return there we have it, our result that we were expecting. And now I'm actually going to show you guys. So that was kind of an overcomplicated way of filtering things. It not necessarily overcomplicated, but just way more code than we needed, because we don't really need this return statement here, right? We can get rid of this return, and the arrow implicitly returns anything after it. So those brackets are useless. And look, we can do this again with the filter method, because the filter method knows to filter based on the specs that you passed it. So not only can we get rid of the whole return statement here, but we can get rid of the if statement. We're only interested, we just want to tell it, all right, we want to filter this for each year and bring me it back if the year is less than 2000. Now if we console log this, let me get rid of that extra layer of fat there. We get the exact same result, and that's just showing like the power of the arrow function combined with these array methods. You can minimize so much code. And if we look back on, this is how it originally looked, and now we got that trimmed down to this. And if you can imagine before, if we wanted to do the old way of filtering, we would have to declare a new array, similar to having to declare an incrementer. We'd have to say new array is equal to an empty array, and then do a for loop, push into that array as we pass our spec by spec. But the filter just does all of that heavy lifting for us, and we're able, yeah, we can just filter right on the year and pass it these 10 characters and get us the exact same result, which is so powerful of the filter method. Let's see. Let's move on to, let's do a quick example with our big animals array here, and we want, let's filter where let's go to all male animals, all right? So console log this, or comment out that, we'll say const male animals. We're gonna its parameters is gonna be an animal array. We'll do our arrow, and then we want to return this animal array dot filter. We're gonna filter on each animal, and remember, this is self-defined. This is not, animal is absolutely not an important word here. It's just our naming convention and keeping things clean. And we are only interested if the sex is male, right? So now we want to filter animal.sex is equal to male. And that's it. And now we can console log male animals. Oh, I never actually passed it our animals. So great, and look, and now we have only our male animals in an entirely new array. And yeah, it basically just shows you how much you can get done in so little with these very, very helpful array methods that we have available to us. So I think that's good enough for filter for now. Let's move on to map. Now map can sort of do the same thing as filter, except map also has the power to just make an entirely new array based on the specs that you pass into the map. So let me just get straight into an example. So let's say we want to multiply each year by 2 and put that into a new array. I know it's absolutely useless, but it's our little contrived example we'll go with here. So we'll define a function years times 2. And we want a year array, and we want to return now year array dot map, and map is going to be almost exactly the same as filter, where it's expecting us to define a parameter for this callback function that it's about to do. So we want to map each year, and we want the new value to be year times 2, and it's actually as simple as that. What you're saying is you're passing it in, and what do you want to return as the new value for your array right there. And if we console log that, year times 2 is not defined because it is years times 2, and once again I keep forgetting to pass some arguments in there. Great, and here you have our completely useless array of years times 2. Don't know if you'll ever need that information, but the point is how you're able to map any sort of value from one thing to an entirely different thing. We could have done times whatever. We could have changed it to a completely different thing. There's so much we could have done. And let me go on to show you guys a better example. Let's say in our animals array, we want an array of just the names. We just want an array that has each of the animal names, right? We'll get rid of that for now. So we'll say const animal names is equal to, it's a function where its parameters, where its parameter is an animal array, and we want to map on that animal array. We want to return the mapped array is what I'm saying, or what this arrow is actually saying. So we're returning whatever this maps. So we want to go through each animal, and all we care about in this new array, the return value of each animal, is simply the animal name, right? So we go through each animal. What do you want me to return from this animal? I want you to return the name, and you can do that with any other aspect of it. We'll console log animal names on the animals, and there we have it. Just nothing but the names. And also, just, I guess I'll get away from the one-liner really quick just to show a little bit more of a complicated example here. Let's say we want to change the ages from old or young. Instead of a numerical value, we want them to be old or young. We'll call this, I'm running out of creative names. I do not recommend following my laziness by calling it new animal array, but that's what we'll call it for now. And once again, its parameter is going to be the animal array, and we want, once again, to map this array. We want to go through each animal. That nothing there has changed. However, now that we're going to have a conditional statement, an if statement basically, we're not going to be able to just do a one-line return. We need to wrap our conditions in the square bracket and manually return the value, the new value that we want. So as we're going through each animal, we just want to see, we'll say like the cutoff will be 10 years old. Is less than 10 is young, greater than 10 is old. It obviously differs for each animal, but I guess we're not going for historical accuracy here. So if the animal age is less than 10, we want to completely override the animal age to be young. Else, we don't really have to put anything else here besides the else statement, because we could assume if it's not less than 10, then we want to change the animal age to old. Now, the only thing that's actually missing here is we've never returned anything just yet for this map. In the callback function that we passed the map, nothing is being returned. So now that we've actually altered the animal the way that we want it altered, so one of these has taken place, now we're good to return the animal itself, because now it has the new key value pairs that we have assigned to it, and it's ready to be brought back and returned to this map, where then it can go on to the next animal and then the next animal. So yeah, let's console log the new animal array, and hopefully we will have old and young in place of the old numbers there. So new animal array, animals, pass that in, and awesome. Here we go. We got age, young, old, young, old, young, old, old, young, young, young. So it looked like I followed a pattern there when I was making this, but I mixed it up a little bit. So yeah, I think that is about good for map. I don't want to take up all of your guys' time, so let's move on to reduce, which is hailed as both the most useful by most people. They will say this is the most useful of array methods because it's sort of a Swiss Army knife where it can do anything. It can filter, it can map, any of the above, along with many other things, and it's also a little bit more difficult than the other higher order functions that we've gone over. So I think the easiest way to show you guys reduce is to sort of just get right into an example. And I'll definitely break it down once we're done with it, just so we can go through step by step of what has happened, really. So first things first, reduce is mainly good for accumulating values in an array. Once again, don't forget that reduce has many, many, many uses, but its main use is to accumulate values, or that's at least how I've seen it most of the times. So let's say we want to, let's just count up the total age of all animals. Okay? So now we're going to say, we're going to declare our function, we'll call it total age. Its parameter, once again, is going to be an animal array. And now we want to return animal array dot reduce. Now normally what you're thinking is, alright, I want to declare it an animal, that's going to be its first argument, but that's not quite the case for reduce. We've got a little bit more parameters that we need to pass in here. And the first parameter is going to be the callback function like we have been passing, and the second is actually going to be the starting value. For this case, we want to start at 0, and I'll show you guys what happens when you change around the starting value. But basically it's just saying, hey, where do you want to start? And since we're adding all the ages of these animals, we just want to start at 0. We don't want to start at 10, for example, and then add from 10. We want to add from 0. So 0 is going to be our starting point. But now, also what's more interesting about this callback function is it has two parameters. So accumulated value and animal. So similar to above, the animal is basically each element of this array. So we're going to go through each and every one of these, which we have defined as animal below. And here is the new thing, the accumulated value. So the accumulated value is what's going to, well, accumulate as we go through each animal. And as we keep returning values, the accumulated value will actually stay at where you last left it off. So I guess enough blabbing around, and I'll just show you how this function is going to work by adding each animal age. And right now it's actually really simple. We opened up our brackets, so we're just going to go ahead and return right off the bat the accumulated value. So this is what we're accumulating, what we're adding each age to, plus equals animal.age. And that should be it. Let me console log that just to make sure. And I finally remembered to pass the animals in there. Alright, and total age is 146. That's all of their ages combined. Now, one way that I like to look at reduce is, I'm going to put this up here. So nArray.reduce, you're calling that method on it, right? The first, so second comes the starting value. That's after you've already defined your callback and everything inside of it, right? Sorry, let me clean this up. So you got reduce. The first parameter in here is always not starting, it's the accumulated value. Or accumulated total, I should call it. Or no, value's better, value's better. Accumulated value, so it's what is growing as you're reducing is your accumulative value. And here, the second one is what you're adding to the value, what you're using in order to pass something into this accumulated value, if that makes sense. In this case, it was our animal, where we're adding the animal age. And in a simpler example, say we wanted to add all the years, like say we wanted to add the total of all the years, right? So here it would just be year plus year. So that makes a lot more sense, right? Like the add to value. We're going to add the year to the accumulated value. But since we're dealing with the object, which is a little bit more complicated, where it's actually the animal and then the animal age we want to add to the accumulated value. But for now, this is a good little syntax to get your mind going the right direction of what a reduce needs to look like. You want your accumulated value, what you want to add to that accumulated value for each index in the array you're reducing on, and then of course the starting value. And really quick, starting value, if we put it as 100, oh, this is causing an error. If we put the starting value as 100 over here, then we'll get 246. So it's literally just your starting point. Now, to get into like a more difficult problem of reduce, where you could kind of see the power of it beyond just like starting from 0 and adding a bunch of numbers, let's think of a new example where we'll say, let's say we want to make an object. I'll kind of draw out the ending point here, where we want to count how many of each species are in there. So we'll say say in our animals array we have 1 dog, we have a cat, 2 cats, etc., right? And we just want to count how many of each species there are and store that into an object, right? So let's do const animal count. That is going to take an animal array as its parameter, as usual, as we've been doing. And then what we want to return is that animal array dot reduce. Now this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because we're not we're not adding from 0 or anything. We want our thing being accumulated to be an actual object. So so here will be our callback function, get that out of the way. But now our starting point is actually, our starting point's an empty object, because we want this object to grow as we reduce through the original array, right? So in the callback function, instead of calling it accumulated value, we'll call it accumulated obj and animal. We're going through each animal in order to add things to our object, right? So, let's see. Just to keep things clean, we'll say current animal equals animal dot species. So we're going through each animal. I'm just kind of pulling out a variable. So when we go to the first animal, lizard. So now the species being lizard, we have that available to us as current animal. And let me see how we're going to do this. Actually, I think right now would be a really good time to divert into, because it's the first thing that comes to mind, and I think it's super, super, super useful to know these, this trick here with the object keys, object.values, and object.entries. I promise this will be really quick, but if you haven't heard about this, you'll be very happy I went over it, because it helps you turn values and keys of an object into an array, so you can actually use array methods on them, and that includes the array methods that we're doing above. But I'm particularly interested in a different array method. You'll see that in a second, but let me, for now, I'm going to comment this out just for the moment, just so I can go over object keys, values, and entries for you. So let's say object.keys animals 0. So what this is actually going to return, const, let's see, the animal 0, we're just going to look at the 0th index first, just to show you guys an example of the object.keys, values, etc. So we're looking at this first object. The object.keys is going to give us an array of each key in this object. So we're going to get an array of name and with age, with sex, and then species. So there will be 4 indexes with each key in that. So let's just console log that really quick, just so you guys can see it. Right, so now we have object.keys, name, age, sex, and species. Great. How about same thing except values? And as I'm sure you've already guessed, instead of the keys, it's just the values to those keys that we're going to get. So we get the name value, the age value, and the sex value, and the species value, all in a separate array with this second one here, the object.values. And lastly, we get object.entries, which will actually return an array of arrays containing both the keys and the values. Get rid of that. So as you see here, the 0th index has the first key and the first value together. The first index has the second key and the second value together, and so on and so forth. So that's the great use of object keys, values, and entries. So now going back to the reduce function up here, what I was planning on doing is I want to see, so we're starting out with an empty object here. I want to see if that object does not contain our current animal species. And I guess I can actually clean that up a little bit to current species. So if it doesn't contain that current species, we want to set that value to 1. And if it already does contain that current species, we can assume it already has the numerical value as a value, to the object key. So then we just want to increment it. So speaking in that term, now we can use the object.keys. So if object.keys of our accumulated object dot includes, and includes is another array method which simply returns a true or false or Boolean value, whether or not the array actually contains it. So now that we've converted these keys into an array, we're able to use this includes method, which is really nice and helpful to our problem here. So if it includes the current species, which we defined up here, actually, yeah, if it doesn't include, so if it does not include the current species, so if this object dot right up here that we started with does not include the current species, which it doesn't since it's completely empty, we want to say then accumulated object on the current species, so that key value is now going to be equal to 1. Else, we don't need an else, because now if it already makes it past that first if statement, we get to our else, which is where we want to say accumulated object on the current species key, just increment that value. Just increment it up plus 1. And now I'm sure you've noticed the last thing that we're missing is the return value for inside of this reduce callback. And now, once again, now that we've altered our accumulated object the way that we wanted to alter it, now we're safe to return it. Accumulated obj, return accumulated obj, and there we have it. I'm almost positive that'll work. Let's console.log animal count animals, and if that doesn't work, we can troubleshoot. But great, I think it worked just fine. We have 1 lizard, 3 dogs, 3 cats, a tortoise, a dragon, and a monkey. So yeah, let's walk through it really quick again. So we define our function up here, we give it a parameter, and this animal count function returns the array reduced by the accumulated object, which we start down here, and then the animal. So we go through, so starting in these brackets, we're going through each separate animal that's in this animal array. So we define the current species just to keep it cleaner. Otherwise, we would have to do, instead of current species here, we'll have to do animal.species, animal.species, and so on and so forth. So it keeps it a little bit cleaner. So then we say if the object.keys of the accumulated object, and as we learned below, object.keys just gives us an array of whatever keys are in this object, which starts out at nothing. So in that case, all right, the current species is 1. So that's where we get the first lizard from. Then it goes on to the next, dog. Dog is equal to 1. So at this point, it actually looks like lizard is 1, dog is 1. And then it looks like it gets to a second dog. We'll fast forward until we do get to a second dog. So now, say the object looks like this, it's going to see, all right, if object.keys accumulated object, now dog is part of those keys, includes the current species. So the next time that this got to dog, it's actually going to fail this spec. So then it's just going to accumulate it. So that's how dog got up to 3 eventually. And yeah, it just kept working its way through the entire thing. So using this, you can see how, yeah, there's like the super simple example above where you start at 0 and you just keep adding from there. But you can like actually build things here, and it sort of opens your mind to all the other things that you're able to do with reduce, depending on whatever you decide to put inside of there. Yeah, so I think that's it for reduce. And before I end the video, I just want to show you guys what it looks like when you're actually able to link everything, which is really fun to do, where you can just chain these methods one after the next. And let's do a quick example, just so we can test it out and see if we can get it to work. So we have our chain function. Let's look at this. How do we want to... What about if we took every cat we got their name and returned it into one string with commas in between it, right? So we want, let me get all of this above here, let me get this below. Alright, so what did I say? We want the cat's names like cat name 1, cat name 2, cat name. We've already discovered there are 3 cats up here, so know that there are 3 cats. So that's our ultimate end goal, right? And right now we just have this massive object to work with. But let's see how we could chain these functions together to get our desired result. So moving forward, and once again, we only have our one parameter, which is the animal array. And first things first, let's filter and get only our cats, right? So I'm actually going to bring this down just so we can, yeah, so we'll do animal array dot filter. Each animal, remember, we go through each animal and we want to filter it on where animal dot species is equal to cat, capital C cat. Right, so that's first things first. Now if I were to, let me console.log, we'll keep checking this chain func step by step to make sure we don't miss anything or get caught up in the knot. We want to go through our animals. So right now we should at least just have our cats, and let me get rid of this so it cleans up our console up there. Great. So first things first, we filtered on only the cats. Check. So then, now that we've filtered, we can do our map, where now we have our cats array, right? But we're only interested in their names. So this is where we're going to map this array into an entirely new array based on however we define it. So instead of animal, I'm actually going to, now that we're dealing with cats, I'm going to put cat in animal spot. So map over each cat, and all I care about in this new array is cat.name. And now if I return that, great, awesome. We have an array of 3 cat names. And lastly, normally it would be easier to join, but for the sake of showing you guys the chaining, we'll just do a reduce. And here we go. We have our callback function. I'm going to lay out right there. And I will set our starting value, since we want a string. Our starting value is going to be the empty string. Our accumulated total is going to be the ending string, right? And we're going through each name. Right, so actually instead of these arrows, we will be able to just do the one-line return statement, because all we really want to do right here is add to the end string the name, right? So we're reducing on each one of these indexes referred to as a name, and we're saying, all right, we're starting with this empty string, add the first name to it. Right, now add the second name to it. However, I almost forgot, we need to add a comma and a space to the end of it. So now actually a problem has arisen where if we run this, we're going to have a comma at the end of the last one along with the space. And that can be solved by yet another chain of an array method of slice, and we can just slice off those last 2 indexes, and voila. I guess I should comment this out now. And great, now we have all of our cat names in one simple string. So yeah, that was a quick example to show you guys what it looks like chaining these methods together, and the possibilities are pretty endless. And you guys will definitely, once you guys get the hang of this, I'm sure that you'll be able to like chain these things all together and make some really cool functions. But yeah, I think that finally sums up this tutorial. I'll hopefully have some timestamps. I'll put some more documentation in the video description so you guys can skip forward and backward as much as you need. But feel free to comment any questions or anything, if I even get any viewers here. But hopefully this helps somebody, and have a good one.